Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching India's World with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Bordered by the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, India is the second most populous country and the biggest democracy in the world. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund recognize India as the sixth largest economy on the planet. India's dynamic foreign policy and the willingness of countries to forge a close partnership with New Delhi as an upcoming global power pose a serious challenge to a world order in which the US, Russia, China and the EU are competing for dominance. India's huge energy demands also mean that oil and gas producers have a difficult job vying with each other and satisfying the needs of the third biggest energy consuming country in the world. India maintains neutrality in international affairs but tries to play an active role on the global stage through diversifying its economic partners, engaging in UN peacekeeping missions and keeping an eye on a possible permanent seat in the UN Security Council. On this edition of India's World, we will look back at India's foreign policy in 2018 and what to expect in 2019. Joining me on the program today are KP Nayar, Strategic Analyst, Sreeram Chaulia, Dean, Jindal School of International Affairs, and Shashank, former Foreign Secretary. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador Shashank, let me begin the program with you. How would you look back at India's year when it comes to foreign policy in 2018? I think before we speak broadly, let's focus first on the neighborhood and then widen our scope.
Well, in the neighborhood, there have been changes of governments, number one. Secondly, China has made deep inroads into most of the neighborhood economies. And third, I would say that most of these countries have tried to find a comfort level by talking not only to China, but to the Arab countries, then to USA, Russia also. So this first time we are seeing that Russia and China are coming together to help out some of these countries in the region, whether it's Iran, Afghanistan or Pakistan. So these are the new changes which have happened. I mean, there is no doubt at all that India has been trying to have neighborhood linkages, which we had seen that when Prime Minister Modi took over power, immediately he had invited the prime ministers and other heads of government from the neighboring states and from the countries with Indian PIO populations. So we had expected that India would get a much larger role to play in the neighborhood. But I must say that the Chinese have moved very adroitly and have taken the lead by this BRI initiative, which they are willing to put billions of dollars. And therefore, what India has to do to find partnerships with other countries who can join hands with India to put money there, and India can provide the technical expertise and say that, all right, as a democracy, we respect the wishes of the ordinary people and the political parties in those countries. We don't want to bamboozle them. We don't want to force them to follow our line of thinking.
Absolutely. And Mr. Nayar, where does India's neighborhood policy stand as 2018 comes to an end?
Well, I think compared to, the present government started on a very good note. 2014 approaching the neighborhood, everybody came for Prime Minister Modi's swearing in. Then we went through a bit of turbulence, I mean, Pakistan, Maldives, Nepal. There was considerable amount of turbulence in our neighborhood. We had to come to terms with it. But 2018, the current year, which draws to a close now, things have become even now. I mean, we are on an even keel now. We have managed to establish very good relations with all the neighboring countries except Pakistan, even countries where there have been change in governments. But I want to concentrate a little bit on the domestic dimension of foreign policy in 2018. After all, foreign policy is the articulation of Indian aspirations abroad. So the domestic dimension is very important. You see, compared to the three previous years, I think 2018 will be remembered as the year when consensus returned to foreign policy, domestic consensus returned to foreign policy, in 2018. You see, our politics is very polarized. There is no meeting ground on anything between the opposition and the government. But on foreign policy this year, there has been very little criticism by the opposition of the Narendra Modi government's foreign policy, you see. Previous years there was criticism on how Pakistan was handled. On China there was criticism. It was alleged that Russia has been neglected. Even on the US there was criticism by the opposition. But that has been muted in 2018, and it is very good that domestic consensus on foreign policy has returned, because it tells our enemies that whatever may be our domestic polarization, we are united on foreign policy in protecting our interests.
It gives out this image that, you know, everyone is putting India first.
Yes, and it gives, while it warns our enemies, it gives friends confidence that India is united on foreign policy.
Absolutely. Very well put there by Mr. K.P. Nayar. Yeah. Professor Sreeram Chaulia, like Mr. K.P. Nayar pointed out in the beginning itself, there are several sticking points really as far as some neighbors were concerned, be it, Pakistan, be it China in the beginning of the year after what happened in Doklam in 2017. We had the Wuhan summit as well, and there were several other aspects that took place really in 2018. How did we address some of these major problems?
I think, Frank, this year, 2018, we did a big strategic readjustment. The initial years of the Modi administration, we were quite clear about China posing a strategic challenge and a competition, and we did look up to the United States to a great extent to be able to assist us in creating a more balanced Indo-Pacific region. But I think what has happened is we have done a bit of a reality check with Donald Trump this year, and we have moved away from dependence on the US, as unlike in the previous years, realizing that one, Trump doesn't have any kind of long-term strategic vision, and two, he is not necessarily interested in propping up India as a counterweight to China. So in that kind of environment, we continued with the US in many ways. We had 2+2 dialogue, very important milestone for the first time this year. We also had on the sidelines of G20 the JAI, as Prime Minister Modi called it, Japan, America, India trilateral. But on the other hand, we have been hedging also. Then Wuhan summit you mentioned is very important. I think it was like the landmark diplomatic event of 2018 when our Prime Minister and the Chinese President did an informal walk around and sit down and powwow, and it was very important to rebuild the confidence after the Doklam incident of 2017. So, and we have continuously done this, behind the scenes. The mechanisms are working. There have been no fresh, incidents across the line of actual control. So, great power relations, and likewise, even with Russia, we have made sure that you mentioned that Ms. Nayar was saying there's a fear that Russia was being neglected, but this year, the summit, we are very clear, we are going to buy the S-400 anti-missile system, no matter what the Trump administration's pressure is. So in a way, we asserted ourselves and readjusted to the Trump factor in a big way.
Right.
And I think we have shown, I mean, this is not non-alignment. I think that era is over, but what we are saying is that, we want India to become a great power in its own right, and for that, it needs to show this flexibility and continuous adaptation to the global environment. And that, I think, we have done quite successfully this year. And even with the neighbors, I think Maldives, we were worried about the continuation of a dictatorship there, but we got a result in our favor. Sri Lanka, there was a fear of Mahinda Rajapaksa making a comeback and whether we'll adjust, but ultimately that threat has receded, at least for now. And likewise, in Bangladesh, we expect, continuity. So all these things mean that overall, we are in a relatively secure position with no major threats to our global interests and to our regional interests. And I will give credit to Narendra Modi, because what he did was to show that he is not pro-American. There was all this allegation from the left within the country that somehow he's pro-Western or he's putting all his eggs in the basket. This year he has shown the flexibility and the adaptation to be able to readjust away. If the United States is imposing trade and tariff tariffs on us and imposing trade war on us, we are up for it. We will challenge it. If the United States is not interested in helping us rise, we will look for alternatives and diversify. I think that's the big message we have sent today.
Okay, let's broaden our scope now a little bit away from the neighborhood and look at Asia on the whole. Ambassador, a lot has happened on the Japan front, and is that something that we'll be looking forward to in 2019 as well?
Well, we had already discussed a little bit about this, that India is trying to find friends who can work with India in the neighborhood and in our relationships with other countries. So there has been talk about the Asia-Africa growth corridor. The other is the Indo-Pacific maritime security cooperation. And there again, we are talking to the Japanese as well as also holding trilateral meetings, including the United States. So that is one. Second is that Iran has been a strategic partner along with Afghanistan on the questions of making Afghanistan stable. So we have been able to get a special reprieve from the Americans, though it is only a tentative for 6 months, but we should be able to purchase our oil from the Iranian side, while in the hope that future perhaps the Americans and the others will come to some agreement on the keeping the this agreement on JCPOA on Iran's nuclear work. Chinese and Russians have been helping us in the sense that we are all together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We had the trilateral meet in Buenos Aires, the Russians, Chinese and India also, along with JAI. So therefore, India has tried to keep a flexible approach that we want India's interests to be kept in mind, and Mr. Nayar is quite right that our friends and other adversaries, they all know that next year there are elections in India, and therefore Indian government will do only those things which will be in the interest of the Indian people as a whole. And so the consensus which has been built around the Indian foreign policy at the domestic level is also helping the country to have flexibility of approach by our distant and other neighbors.
Right. You know, Mr. Nayar, talking about not the immediate neighborhood, but in the region, of course, in Asia, let's not forget the year started with the visit of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to India. Now, a first in nearly 15 years, really, as far as head of state of Israel is concerned. How would you look back at that?
Well, our relations with Israel has always been good. I mean, ever since we opened diplomatic relations in the 90s, it has been good. But there was always some hesitation to make public what we are doing with Israel, publicize it. That hesitation ended. But since you mentioned Israel, I want to point out something else that happened in 2018, which is very, very significant. You see, we made an reopening to Syria. You see, after the so-called Arab Spring broke out and President Assad was under pressure, we cut down our mission. There was a representation, but still we pruned the mission. Indian companies left and all that. But M.J. Akbar, who was External Affairs Minister, Minister of State, he visited Syria, which was very perceptive, you see, because now almost 9 months later, 9 months after M.J. Akbar's visit, the Americans are following us, I mean, Trump's decision to pull out of Syria is a recognition that Assad is there to stay. So we were actually, M.J. Akbar was ahead of everybody else in opening the door to Syria again. But he also visited Jordan and Lebanon. Lebanon again was neglected for a very long time. So that was one thing in the region. The other thing is, unfortunately, this hasn't got much publicity. I mean, quite amazingly, we quadrupled the aid to Palestinians. You see, in the Indian media, it doesn't get much publicity because Palestine is not very sexy in terms of news. But the Modi government increased the aid to United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees by 4 times, you know. So we have made inroads into the region. It is not just Israel, into the entire region.
Yeah, and we've played the balancing act quite well.
Indeed, indeed, yes.
Right. Professor Chaulia, Afghanistan, now let's focus a little bit on Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is extremely important as well. After, you know, a policy of not engaging with the Taliban, we seem to have had non-official talks, you know, with the Taliban as well. So Afghanistan is going to be important too.
Well, I think this was a year when the Afghan state, our ally, lost a lot of ground, and it is a matter of grave concern for us in India that you know, the Afghan National Army has not been able to hold on to territory, and there are governance issues there, and the Taliban is on the rampage, and there's also the ISIS factor, which is from time to time causing, you know, sensational attacks on civilians. The degree of violence and the loss of Afghan troops. Ashraf Ghani, the Afghan president, revealed that in the last 2.5 to 3 years, the official count, they lost 28,000 or more forces. So on average, just calculate the kill rate. It is tremendous, you know. And I think the American withdrawal, Trump's you know, plan to withdraw and cut down American presence in Afghanistan, which came towards the end of the year, all these are warning signs for us. In a way, we have, you know, we have stuck to Iran and the Chabahar, which is important for stabilizing Afghanistan. We opened new routes, and you know, there are all kinds of flights happening, wheat shipments happening between Afghanistan and India through Chabahar. We are doing a lot, but the pure developmental, you know, diplomacy may not be sufficient in 2019 if the security situation worsens. And really, I think it will be a test for Modi administration as to how we can come up with a regional plan. You know, we've been talking about the regional end game for a long time.
Right.
But now that the Americans are showing intent to isolate and to withdraw, more or less, I mean, if they are down to 7,000 troops, they cannot really shore up the Afghan state very much. So now we are talking about what can China, India and Russia, RIC, which we recently met in G20, what can we do for Afghanistan? I mean, Pakistan remains the main problem there, but nonetheless, what can the rest of the three of us do? Because if we cannot ride piggyback anymore on an isolationist US to shore up the, you know, flagging Afghan state.
Right.
And as far the peace process goes, we are aware, we have been also called on numerous occasions. Zalmay Khalilzad, the US peace envoy, has been also keeping us informed. But I would say that, you know, direct talks between Taliban and Americans are okay. But what we will want to ensure is that our interests and the long sacrifice, the treasure and the blood that we have invested in that country cannot be, you know, summarily, you know, removed from and, you know, neglected. And therefore, we will need to fight for our interests there. At the same time, we have to keep the Afghan people's interests in the long term.
Absolutely,
and we want peace. We want peace. We want to be seen as not obstructing peace and saying that, you know, this is some kind of proxy war where influence is all that matters. But at the end of the day, Indian influence means peace in Afghanistan.
Right.
There is no contradiction between the two.
All right. Let's broaden the scope now even further, Ambassador, and look beyond Asia. Let's look at Europe, Africa, North and the Americas as well. What were the highlights for you there?
Well, in Europe, we find that Brexit has been going apace. There is some talk that there might be a second referendum. But at this moment, Prime Minister May is going for a hard choice. So which is not very popular with the British public, that is succumbing to the agreement which has been forced upon her by the European partners. Both European Union and the British are very much interested in the free trade area agreement with India, building up stronger ties with the world countries like China, India and others. And therefore, that is the new situation which we will face in 2019. In Africa, we find that the Chinese have made deep inroads. They have given almost $300 billion worth of promised assistance. And in many areas, a lot of Chinese people have moved in. The Chinese have given support to many governments which are not very popular with their own people. And so there is a criticism. And therefore, there is a possibility that India might be once again requested to move more effectively in Africa because they have greater faith in the Indian technical abilities and the India's political kind of a participation in these countries.
Right.
As far as America is concerned, yes, US-India relations definitely are much better than ever before. There have been military exercises bilaterally, trilaterally, and there is this, India can take satisfaction that the Americans have been putting pressure on Pakistan to get rid of the terrorists who have been spreading instability in all the neighboring countries. They have not given us complete satisfaction, but I must say that there is a much greater sympathy for the Indian position in the United States, and I think that we should be happy about that. The other Latin American countries and Canada, etc., there have been many visits to India. They have been trying to promote relations with India very strongly. But the point is that they have their own issues which are going on right now. Venezuela is unstable. Brazil also is facing a lot of difficulty. They are now getting a Trump type of a very pro-conservative, very conservative administration. So we have to keep in mind that the world is changing constantly, and India has to be flexible in 2019 to take care of its interests, but at the same time to make sure that our main area of action would be in Asia, to make sure that Asia remains peaceful, that our relationships which we are trying to develop with Japan on one hand, China on the other hand, they remain. Russia remains a friend, and we have been carrying on military exercises also with many of these countries. So I think this should continue.
All right. Mr. Nayar, is there anything that you would have liked to have been done differently?
In 2018?
Yes.
Not really, I mean,
so everything was on track, you believe?
Well, there are things that could have been different, but we don't do things like that, I mean, for example, like Russia influenced the elections. I would have been very happy if India could influence the midterm elections, But number one, we don't do things like that. And secondly, I don't think we have the wherewithal to interfere in another country's elections. Well, not really, everything was on well. But perhaps there is one thing I would say, which is more to do with the media rather than the government itself. You see, the media, I'm not talking of our channel, I'm talking of the private media in particular, television, goes on and on about terrorism, Throughout the year, you switch on any channel, anchors on foreign policy talk about terrorism, you see. Yes, there is a terrorist threat to India, but the fact is that in 2018 there has hardly been any terrorist activity incidents in India except Kashmir, you see. So while the threat of terrorism is there, some anchors, some journalists are making a career out of terrorism, you see. I was with a minister, a union minister the other day, and he was telling one of these anchors who makes too much of terrorism, look, you should highlight the fact that after Pathankot, there have virtually been no terrorist attacks against India, barring Kashmir, which is an old problem. So you should highlight the fact, instead of going on about terrorism, you should highlight the fact that India has contained terrorism, you see. And this minister was telling this anchor, look, you should also take into account the fact that nobody wants to invest in a country where there is terrorist activity, you see. So we are trying to invite investment. Warren Buffett and George Soros and people like that wouldn't want to invest in a country where there is terrorism.
Right.
So I would very much like in 2019 that these media people who have made a career out of talking about terrorism should turn down their bombast and instead concentrate on our successes in containing terrorism rather than talking about terrorism bogey, because we also need that in order to attract investment.
Right.
We have to show that there is no terrorism in India, that India is a peaceful place to invest.
Right.
That is what I would like to see in 2019.
Right. All right. Professor, what were the key factors that were limiting and also driving India's foreign policy in 2018?
I think one of the factors, Frank, is the foreign economic, diplomacy, and that, I think has really picked up pace. And I think that's one of the reasons we should be satisfied with the Modi government's performance this year, because you see the inward FDI has been $61 billion or more. It's a record and continues to be that way for the last 4 years. And every year, year on year, it's been an improvement. And secondly, our ease of doing business ranking of the World Bank has also again shot up by a large number of places. So if you take these two together, the message that of stability and security and that India is a good place where you can get return on investment has spread. And Prime Minister continues to indefatigably, go around the world and continue to woo and quote foreign investors in a big way. And I think that yields all these, outcomes, because end of the day, it is not a flash in the pan. We are not talking about only year one of Modi administration when this was going great. For 4 years, he has sustained it. Now, 5th year also, we are doing this. So I think it shows that on foreign economic diplomacy, especially with global CEOs, with sovereign wealth funds, all the wooing has worked. And now we are yielding the, benefiting from the yields of that. And you will see that in 2019, growth projections for India, economic growth are high. It's not only because of domestic reasons. It's because the international community, especially the global holders of capital, are showing great level of confidence in India.
Right.
And I think when we go into 2019, we can say with our heads held high that, we have consistently shown that India has left behind a kind of a laggard kind of a image and is now leaping. And so there may be some questions about Make in India and domestic, labor regulations and those kind of things. But overall, if you see, the image we have projected has been positive and has been believed by the bulk of the international community consistently for 4.5 years.
Right.
And going into 5 years. And I think foreign economic diplomacy is one area we often neglect in assessing Modi administration. That is where he gets an A+.
All right. Very quick closing comments from all my guests on, what to expect in the new year. Ambassador?
Well, in 2019, while the concentration of the Modi government would be on the elections in the country, so I think whatever we have achieved so far, we should continue to maintain those relationships with these countries. If there are any dialogues which are required at bilateral or the trilateral level, they should be continued.
Right.
So that the diplomats and the other officials, they should continue doing their work while the Prime Minister may be busy with the election rhetoric within the country.
All right. Mr. Nayar?
Our only major partner, which is on the cusp of change, is the United States. Bangladesh, there is an election, but I expect Hasina to come back. So, but the United States is on the cusp of a change. The new Congress is coming in January. And we need to invest more on Capitol Hill, I mean, we already have a strong influence on Capitol Hill, but we need to do more because Trump is no longer reliable. Who knows, Trump may not even be president at the end of by the end of 2019. So Congress is our bulwark for promoting our interests. We need to concentrate a lot more on Capitol Hill in 2019.
Professor, close the show for us.
So while I said that we had readjusted to the Trump reality and had worked it out with the Chinese, I still believe that China remains the predominant source of insecurity for India geopolitically, and the Indo-Pacific is where a lot of work needs to be done in terms of formations, small group coalitions. It's not only with the Japan, which of course is central to us, but also with ASEAN countries, specific ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Vietnam. We need to do a lot more, I think, to feel like we have warded off this shadow that is looming over our strategic space. We have to preserve our supremacy in the Indian Ocean and also maintain our relations in a manner where our influence is not going to be frittered away. So I think that's a long-term challenge for 2019. Throughout the year, we will face this constant issue of how do we manage the spreading Chinese influence and how do we work it out with smaller partners in a way which is not seen as intruding on their sovereignty, but at the same time protecting our interests. It's a thin, it's a narrow tightrope act.
All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. Have a happy new year.